From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Futureproofing Canada. I'm Jennifer Ditchburn, President and CEO of the IRPP. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, BMO Financial Group, for their generous support of this podcast. Now, for the past 4 years, IRPP has been hosting an annual fall event where we feature an important voice in public policy. This year's keynote speaker was Timothy Caulfield, one of North America's best-known crusaders against misinformation, especially health misinformation, pseudoscience, and all things bunk. He is a professor at the University of Alberta's Faculty of Law and the School of Public Health, and research director at the university's Health Law Institute. Professor Caulfield has taken on the beauty industry, homeopathy, anti-vaxxers, the sports rehab community, Gwyneth Paltrow, and others. His new book is called The Certainty Illusion: What You Don't Know and Why It Matters. He explores why it's getting even harder to separate good information from bad information and even dangerous information, and the forces that are driving that information chaos. Here's our conversation. Timothy Caulfield, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So I was reflecting on some of the information traps that you highlighted in your book. Excellent book, really accessible, great read. And I was thinking to myself, oh my God, I did most of these things this week. So I put on natural mascara because I was afraid that the old stuff had bad chemicals. I looked up a restaurant based on online reviews. I looked for a doctor based on online reviews. I've been eating a ton of protein because all of the women's health people tell me I should be eating bacon and eggs and all kinds of things at breakfast. And I threw out some black kitchen utensils because I read an article online that black kitchen utensils were made in China from remanufactured electronics and that they were making me sick. So that was just in 1 week or 2 weeks. How would you describe this information environment that we're all living in and coping with?
Chaos. If I could pick one word, I think chaos is a pretty good one. It's a pretty good one. And it's also frenetic. I think that's another good way to describe it, because we live in so much noise right now. It's bombarding us constantly. And that adds to the power of the misinformation, because it plays to our emotions, it plays to our needs, right? You have a moment where you need to make a quick decision, and the algorithms know that, right? And they're going to feed you that information that you need. So I think chaotic, frenetic, and misleading. If I had to pick 3 words, I think that's pretty good.
And how has it changed? I mean, we've always, since we've had the interweb, since we've had the internet, there's been a lot of information coming at us, 24/7 news, all that. But what's different now?
Yeah, and I have been studying this for decades, right? So it is interesting to see how it's shifted and it's changed. And I'm going to pick 2, and one's very obvious, and it's, of course, social media, right? And it is obvious. And by social media, I put under that umbrella influencers, podcasters, and put under that umbrella. It really has become, if not the dominant way that we now get information, right? Certainly, perhaps the first exposure to information comes through some kind of social media platform. And there's a growing body of evidence that tells us that leads to polarization, again, primarily because the algorithms play to our preconceived notions. They play to and they facilitate our rage and grievance, because they benefit from rage and grievance and fear. They being, of course, the platforms. So that is just a significant shift. I could go on and on about social media. I think it's probably no surprise to you and others. But the other one I find fascinating, and we're doing research on this, is the degree to which political identity, community, drives what we believe. And I'm putting believe in scare quotes, because I think even the notion of believing has shifted a little bit. The notion of facts, I think that's sort of shifted a little bit. But especially in the health space, you know this so well, like it's your world. Politics has always been lurking in the background. It's always part of our discussions and our beliefs. But increasingly, what we believe has become a flag to the community that we belong to. And I'm not being partisan here because we all do this. We all do this, right?
It's left or right.
Left, right, middle, whatever, populists, we all do this to some degree, sort of pick your topic. And that's, especially in the health space, it's always been there, but now it's like the dominant force. And so I find that fascinating. And it's a little bit of a bad news story because research also tells us the more something becomes about personal identity, who we are, the more difficult it is to change someone's mind. In the book, in my most recent book, and maybe the readers didn't even notice this because I tried to sneak it in there, I use music as an example, right? I grew up, I was a punk. And so anyone else was like the enemy, the other side, right? And I think we can all remember doing this. We do this with sports teams, you pick your passion. And there's really interesting research that tells us that the iconography around a band is more important, listen to this, it's more important than the songs to whether we like the band or not, right? What it represents to us, in our team, and pull that out, like pull the lens out. And we do that with politics. We do that with how we think about vaccines, how we think about climate change, how we think about LGBTQ plus issues. We pick the topic and we do the same thing. And I think increasingly, because the algorithms that create our information environment invite us to do it and reward us if we do it.
I'm going to come back to the question of political identity because it's important to this discussion. But in your book, you talk about three driving forces that are driving beliefs and behaviors: science, goodness, and opinion. And I want to talk about each of those. On the science force, you talk about quantum physics and an example of quantum physics as something that's been distorted to sell all manner of products and services. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, quantum everything, right? There's quantum therapy, there's, quantum supplements. It's a phenomenon I call science exploitation. So you take a real area of science that has a lot of excitement around it, and you use that language to legitimize bunk. We do it with stem cells. One of my favorite examples is microbiome. If we could get in a time machine and go back 7 years, how many people would even know what the microbiome was or is, right? People might have a vague idea. Now it's on shampoo bottles, right? It's on supplements. It's everywhere. You can't buy a product that isn't good for your microbiome, even though there's really no evidence to support those claims. And often, as I joke in the book, they don't even try to explain how the microbiome or stem cells or quantum is relevant to the product. They're just using that word to give a veneer of legitimacy to the product. And you know what? It works. It works. The studies show that that kind of sciencey language really does make us believe it a little bit more. Quantum's a great example because it's so sciencey sounding. It almost has become, it's cutting edge if it's quantum, but it's also mysterious, right? And so I think it's really good for those kind of products that are also trying to leverage spirituality and suggest that they're at the cutting edge of knowing. Quantum captures that, even though it's total bunk.
Yeah, you talk about pseudo-profound language as
Yeah.
well. So there's sciencey language. And what's pseudo-profound language?
Can we drop the S word on your podcast?
Yeah, sure.
Because they call it bullshit, and that's become the term of art in the literature, which I think is really funny. That in fact, profound bullshit. I'm sure we're all familiar with it because a lot of new agey people have used this, but now you see a lot of self-improvement gurus use this pseudo-profound language, and it's language that sort of sounds like it's profound, even though it's completely meaningless if you actually unpack it. And Deepak Chopra gets a lot of
You're going up against Deepak Chopra.
He gets hit a lot by these researchers who study this. Actually, a colleague of mine, Gordon Pennycook, did an award-winning article on pseudo-profound bullshit, and he really highlighting the sway of this. And so, yeah, and what we're seeing now is this marriage between that science exploitation phenomena, so quantum, stem cells, and pseudo-profound bullshit, and they're kind of stuck together. You see that a lot in the longevity movement, which is a really popular movement. It's become more popular since I finished the book.
Huge.
Yeah, it's
huge
huge.
with men. I think. I mean, there's the whole menopause movement,
Yeah.
which we could have a whole show about. But there it seems to me that men are being targeted constantly for expand your life, extend your life, with doing all these things. It sounds pretty terrible, actually.
Yeah, you're 100% correct about the longevity movement. I often joke, it seems to be older white men who want to live forever. And I joke that I think it's because the women who are with those men don't want to live another day longer, right? That's what's going on. But I think it's sort of wellness woo for tech bros, right? So I don't think it's any different from any other wellness product. Gwyneth Paltrow and the jade vagina eggs, this is the same thing. And it's just targeted at men, and it really is that pseudo-profound BS, often about how to optimize your life with that sciencey stuff, stem cells, microbiome, you name, get genetic testing and full body MRIs, all that kind of stuff. No evidence to support any of it, but it feels legitimate. And it's interesting because women have been targeted, I think, far more than men by the wellness industry, and we are starting to see that shift. And you're also starting to see that same kind of women were somehow lesser than if you're not doing this. It was almost like you were failing society if you weren't doing absolutely everything you can to stay looking young, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing that same kind of ethos now creep into the manosphere, right? Somehow you're less of a man if you're not doing if you're not lifting stones at 5 a.m., somehow you're not manly, that same kind of language.
One part that I was very interested in your book was about the scholarly community. The IRPP deals a lot with scholars, Canadian scholars mostly. We are looking at trying to set ourselves up as having the same equivalency as a journal. And we do peer review at the Institute. A hell of a lot of editing and reviewing. And you have a section that talks about the sort of mess that is journals and so on. And you talk also about the role that hype plays in the scholarly community, especially when it comes to getting research funding. Can you talk about first the hype and the funding part, and then we can talk about the journals?
Yeah, and this is one of those areas where since even I finished the book, we're starting to see more and more literature on this, more raising concern about this. And I think this is just fundamentally important because if we don't have good science, if we don't have trustworthy science, then we have nothing to turn to fight the broader knowledge crisis that we're in. So, absolutely, getting the academic work right is fundamentally important. And in the book, I argue that a lot of the incentives that are built into our system are distorting the research. And I'm not pointing my finger at any one individual or one organization. I think this is a systemic problem built around the drive to get research grants that demand that you kind of hype your work. And there's been really interesting, and we've actually done a lot of research on the science hype issue. This is something that we've been researching really for decades. And you see that it happens right at the research grant area, especially for big science. If you want millions of dollars to do this research, you've got to pose it as if it's groundbreaking, right? As if you are going to be revolutionizing medicine. How many times have we heard this is going to revolutionize medicine? That hype then is picked up when the research actually happens and when it's written up. The hype happens when the institutions, universities, put out a press release about that work. The hype happens then when it gets into the journal, or hype happens in the media, and then the hype happens even more. It's a hype pipeline, right? When it gets into the commercialized product. Here's a really, I talk about this in the book. Reflect on this. And I've been part of these communities, and I am incredibly pro-science, as you know. You've known me for a long time. Mm-hmm. So I'm not criticizing the scientists or the people working in these areas, and I've been very fortunate to work with all of these areas, has been a big part of my career, and there's just incredible scientists in Canada too in these areas. But think about genomics, stem cells, microbiome, nanotechnology. I mean, you could go on, neuroscience, down the list of all of these areas. When it first came out, you can probably almost even conjure the headlines in your mind if you're old enough. They were promised to revolutionize healthcare. They were going to save countless lives. None of it has happened, like from the 1990s until now. Like billions and billions of dollars, and headline after headline of promises, right? Now, that's not to say that fantastic scientific advances haven't happened and we haven't learned more. You never know what direction science is going to go. That's one of the challenges. That's not to say this work wasn't worthwhile, but the promise was a revolution, and those revolutions don't happen. So why, well, who cares? Well, it does matter for a bunch of reasons. One, people start losing trust in, you've said this was going to happen. Why should we invest in science in the future? The second thing is those who are selling bunk leverage those promises. You said, so now you have all these clinics all over the world selling unproven stem cell therapies. You have all these people selling microbiome products. Think of the headlines, right? That have no efficacy behind them, on and on and on. And everyone's talking about precision medicine now and getting your genes tested. No real profound impact on a population level.
But general research is still important.
Hugely important, hugely important, and I fully support that, right? I think that but the system demands the hype, and that hype then is leveraged. And we're seeing this, we see it, across every discipline, and some are worse than others, of course, but, and it's because of the incredibly competitive nature of trying to get research grants. I was just
And we're talking about Canada, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
if we just focus on, let's say, the Tri-Council system.
That's right.
So
Which has funded my work for 30 years, right?
Right.
So in the book, I geez, did I hype stuff? Am I guilty? And a little bit, I think I was. I think about some of my early stem cell grants. I think I used that revolutionizing language, right? As part of the community, I believed it. And it happens on the other side of the ledger too, right? Those who are doing social science work on harms. Think of genetic discrimination. You're so young, you probably don't remember when.
I think you think I'm young. We're probably the same age, Timothy. Yeah.
The genetic discrimination discussion in the early 90s, early aughts, it was like it was going to be just, Gattaca and dystopia, and none of that happened, right? And that's partly because of my community. The social science community needs to get research grants too, and they need, in order to get that. So you have like the hype on the other side of the ledger too. So there's all these distortions that are happening. Now, the other force, of course, is the publication force, right? The publisher perish thing and is unbelievable, powerful force. And it's about quantity, not quality. And that, I think, nicely leads us to the journal problem.
Right. So there's a lot of flimsy scientific journals out there. They're the good ones, but there's more and more bad ones that sometimes hard to discern because they've got fancy titles. Tell us the story about Dr. Olivia Dahl.
Well, it's interesting because she's become I think, a fairly good friend. We correspond regularly still. And she's remarkable because I think she sits on 7 editorial boards. She publishes quite frequently. She's doing her own research now, I understand. And she does an incredible amount of reviewing. So and I often wonder, maybe she's even reviewed one of my papers. The interesting thing about Olivia Dahl is she's a dog, right? She is a dog.
Okay.
And the point, this was a stunt done by a public health researcher in Australia, and he wanted to make the point that there are these predatory journals out there that have virtually no standards, right? They're journals that exist to serve the publish or perish ecosystem, right? So, every day I get an email from one of these journals inviting me to submit a publication, and then they're published almost immediately, and they charge you a couple $1,000s sometimes, right? And they'll have these editorial boards that are often fake and have people like Olivia Dahl on it. Now, when Olivia Dahl put her name forward, it was obvious she was a dog. Like, it wasn't like he was trying to hide that fact, right? Her favorite hobbies are chasing birds and tummy rubs and things like that, right? Just to highlight even further the degree to which these journals are, and in the book I talk about, we published a paper on homeopathy where I say the title is Homeopathy is Pseudoscience BS, and the method is homeopathy is pseudoscience BS, and the conclusion, I just repeat that sentence over and over again, and I submit it, and it's preliminarily accepted. And then they ended up saying,
it was like The Shining, right? You
yeah,
just wrote the same thing
yeah,
over and over again.
yeah. And then they wrote back and said, it doesn't fulfill our requirements because it's too short. It wasn't that I didn't have references or said the same thing over and over again. This matters. I cannot emphasize enough how much this predatory journal issue matters, because our knowledge base is becoming polluted by these papers. They're even seeping into our systematic reviews and our databases that we turn to get good science. They're taking resources away. Who funds these journals? They're funded by grants. So you know who funds them? The Canadian public funds these journals, right? Which is almost like a criminal operation, right? The other thing is, often these journals are used to push agenda. So you see a lot of anti-vax, people, here's this study on this topic. And very recently, a journalist approached me about raw milk, and the person on the other side of the story was saying, well, here's some studies supporting raw milk, and they were all published in predatory journals. And so even if you take the time, it's almost more than you can ask anyone to do now, right? Take the time to look at the link that leads to a study, and most people aren't going to take the time to do that. You're going to be met with something that looks incredibly legitimate, even though it's not. It might have been reviewed by Olivia Dahl, right?
Right. And what is like the average person that doesn't have the time to
Or even a clinician.
pour through these and establish whether it's a legitimate journal or not, right?
That's right.
You have 52 pages of references in your book. I checked.
Thank you, Penguin, for letting me do
Pretty
that.
amazing. Let's talk about the goodness illusion, which is another driving force behind our beliefs. You talk about a health halo and claims that sound like they're good for you, but they're actually not grounded in science. And some of them actually might surprise people, like non-GMO or chemical-free as claims. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the goodness illusion, and you, I think, really set this up nicely in you're talking about your personal decisions that you made. There are so many strategies that marketers and people pushing products use to sort of leverage our chaotic information environment, right? And our information environment is so chaotic that we're looking for shortcuts. We do it all the time, or looking for signals, right, to help make a decision. And health halos are exactly that. I could have used other examples, but I thought the health halos were, sort of a powerful example. And they're basically words that represent goodness, good choice for myself, maybe for the environment, for my family, for the community. And the ones that, natural, I joke, is the mother of all goodness illusion words. It's everywhere now. It's all, natural. Almost a virtually meaningless word, right? Natural, chemical-free, what does that mean? The world's made up of chemicals. What's it made out of? Fairy dust? I don't know what it would be even made out of. And there are even ones like locally grown, which I find, because, the Caulfields, are all about going to the farmers market on the weekend. But that's a really good one, because I think it highlights, and we're not saying locally grown is bad, but just that the science behind that goodness illusion is almost certainly more complex than you realize. For example, is it better to, that someone puts a basket of apples in the back of their old pickup truck and drives it to the farmer's market? Is that better for the environment than, a million apples on a container ship? That's a complex question, right? But it's portrayed as good. My favorite, and again, you touched on this at the beginning, and one that's exploded since I finished the book is protein. Like, protein is a really good example of a health halo that people can probably even now, most people can remember it emerging, right? It's because it's been really the last 18 months, 2 years.
I think there's a Tim's, isn't there a protein
Starbucks has got a protein, I
Coffee
believe,
or- yeah.
it's everywhere. There's protein potato chips, protein candy bars, protein, you name it.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
stick the word protein on the side and all of a sudden it's magically healthier. The reality is that, depending what study that you look at, somewhere between 20 and, we overshoot, just in our normal eating, our normal diet, we overshoot our protein intake by 20 to 55%. We don't need more protein. Yes, protein is very important. You want to eat healthy protein, et cetera, but there isn't some kind of, and we don't have like a receptacle in our body that will hold that extra protein and utilize it when you need it. You don't grow bigger muscles because you pee it out. You pee it out, or it turns to fat, right? We don't need more protein, but that protein, the word protein has become such a powerful marketing tool. Now, quick caveat here, interesting research around GLP-1s, people taking drugs like Ozempic, interesting research, perhaps they need a little bit more protein, older population, but we're not talking about vastly more, we're just talking about a smidge more protein, right? We're not talking about a huge amount more. But holy cow, and research shows it actually works. The other interesting thing about the protein, there has been some preliminary studies that show that often the product with the protein on the label is actually less healthy because it has, ultra-processed food in it than the one without the protein label. Very similar phenomenon to the gluten-free phenomenon, right? Which is still going strong, right? I'm fascinated by that one because it was almost entirely created by celebrity culture. But again, there's been studies that have shown that many of the store-bought gluten-free products are actually less healthy than their full gluten alternative. Look, if you have celiac disease, et cetera, and you have clinical reason for this, but the health halo is it's inherently healthier because it doesn't have gluten in it. No evidence to support that.
The other illusion that you talk about in your book is the opinion illusion, and I think this will resonate a lot with our listeners because scanning online reviews is something that we all do. I mentioned doctors and restaurants, but there's absolutely everything, right? Appliances or the music that you're going to listen to, right? But you point out that there's a lot of pitfalls involved in that. Can you just tell us the story of Shed Restaurant in London?
Yeah, the Shed, remarkable, because I actually got to interview, and I've kind of become friends with the owner of the Shed in Dulwich. And it was the number one most popular restaurant in London,
I'm
England.
going to London.
Yeah, so
so I
think
was
about
like, I was thinking about it. Okay.
A lot of restaurants in London, London, England, we're talking, not, London, Ontario, some lovely restaurants too, but, London, England, a lot of, number one. And that status was achieved purely fakely. This restaurant never existed. It was fake reviews, fake posts, and he just created this illusion that this restaurant existed. And it demonstrates, of course, the power of online reviews to drive. This can sound like hyperbole, and I tried to quantify this when I was working on it. I think trillions of dollars are moved by online reviews. I think people don't make, as you highlighted, we don't make a decision without looking at online reviews. So real quickly, they're biased. They are shaped by all the cognitive biases that shape all of our decisions, right? Who does an online review? Someone who either hates it or loves it, right? There's a fascinating study there that talks about, which is a really clever study because you can create these big data sets. They correlated the weather to when in the area to when the review was written, and if it's raining outside, there's lower reviews, right?
So if you go to a restaurant and it happens to be
Raining,
pouring outside,
yeah.
or a storm, you're like, I didn't like that place too much.
Yeah. But more importantly, so many of these reviews are fake, are fraudulent, are purchased.
Because it's big business.
It's
I think
a
that's
big
the point you
business.
make is that you can actually make more money and move the dial on your place of business if you have the good
If
reviews.
you have a 3.9, I mean, a lot of people set their I don't even want to look reviews below 4.0, right?
Oh, you just echoed what I say to my friends or my sister. Oh, it's under, it's under 4.5, not going there.
Yeah,
I have a high,
my wife's the same.
4.5.
It is really remarkable the degree to which, and I loved writing this section because this is an area, and we've actually done research since I wrote the book on online reviews because I found it's so fascinating. But I talked to these people who spent their whole life studying online reviews, and I ask all of them at the end of the interview. So these people know they're all fake and almost meaningless. We're just being manipulated by these reviews. Do you still use the online reviews? And everyone said yes.
So what do you do though? I mean, you want to know that you're not going to go somewhere where the food's bad or bad ambiance. Like who?
So
Who do you trust?
So the experts say nothing's perfect, right? The fascinating things. This came up in the Shed and Dulwich story. People trust. Not making this up. They trust the online reviews, and this is how Upa Butler, who owned the Shed and Dulwich, he put it this way: people trust online reviews more than the food in their mouth, right? That is how persuasive they are, and they trust online reviews more than their friends and family. They trust on reviews more than experts. So many of the people I interviewed, the researchers I've interviewed, say, rely more on your friends and family, like people who've actually experienced it. Experts, not perfect, but those expert reviews likely more reliable than online reviews. And then when you talk about physicians, I think this is really important because in the United States especially, but increasingly in Canada, people look at those. There is zero correlation between online reviews and your clinical outcome, right? And in fact, I argue in the book, there's reasons to think there might be an inverse relationship, because if you are a doctor worrying about online reviews, you're going to put your resources and time into things that get you higher online reviews, maybe your waiting room, your staff, that are irrelevant to the clinical outcome, right? So very problematic. And the other thing that's happening now is, and this is something we've started studying, is those pushing unproven therapies, unproven cancer therapies, et cetera, use online reviews to lure patients in, fake ones, obviously. So yeah, it's a big problem.
So let's talk about public policy. That's, the raison d'etre of this podcast, and making sure we're prepared for the future and through public policy. Talk to me about what we're seeing in the United States right now. So there's been a serious erosion in the sort of evidence base, whether it's in the various departments that deal with health issues. What is the threat to us here in Canada, and could it happen here?
Oh, the threat is immediate. Look, the rhetoric in the United States, we don't have a bubble cutting us off from the rhetoric coming from the United States, right? It's immediate, it's now, what's happening in the United States is having an impact on Canada, right? And particularly in my province of Alberta, but I think, really across Canada. I've been on some panels with people and they've said, well, that's happening in the United States. No, this is directly relevant now to what's happening, not just in Canada, but really around the world, right? Look, Joe Rogan, by him, I think was found out today the #1 podcaster in the world again, right? So that rhetoric really matters because it normalizes misinformation. It normalizes, anti-vax rhetoric. It normalizes distrust in scientific institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is an immediate threat. I actually think that places like Canada, and I've argued this in various spaces, need to stand up for science, and almost view this as an opportunity to become a leader in science-informed, evidence-informed policy. And we should try to, fill that void, as the CDC, the FDA, the FTC disintegrate, and we can no longer point the public to entities like that. Canada should step up, and we should start, trying to create statements that reflect what the science really says, and that, not only Canadians can use, but really the world can use.
We rely on some of that data that's coming from the U.S.,
Good
right?
point. Yeah.
Are you worried about CDC, National Institutes of Health? Like, what can we trust that might be coming from the United States?
Hugely, hugely. And not only do we rely on that data, I'm involved in research where we collaborate with researchers down there that are, losing their funding. So I am, I've been very fortunate to be able to work with scientists in the United States, and, I trust them. They know this is a crisis, right? And we're starting to see institutions step up, right, where they are starting to put out statements about, for example, on vaccines, or climate change, things like that. They're stepping up, trying to fill that void with statements from professional organizations, statements from scientific organizations. I think we need more of that, and I think that's a very positive move. We're also seeing even states come together, right, and say, okay, the CDC, FDA, maybe they're not the best source on this topic anymore. We are going to come together and put statements out on childhood vaccination, for example. So those are good moves. I think that we can do this at a national level in Canada, and we ought to do it at a national level in Canada, and again, view it as sort of a Canadian opportunity to fill that void nationally and internationally.
You think politics might get in the way of that? You talked about political identity earlier, and obviously partisan politics can play a role in how we treat information, who we trust, and so on. Are you worried about that, or do you think we could come together on?
I am worried about it. Absolutely, I'm worried about it. Whenever you talk, and I've had the opportunity to speak to politicians in Canada, and if you bring up misinformation, there are some politicians that say you're censorship, and they immediately try to discredit you because you've received funding from the CIHR, one of the tri-councils or something like that. So it's a very nasty space right now. But I think because of what's happening in the United States, I'm starting to sense a shift, a rising. This is what it looks like, right? When you don't follow science, when you try to demonize those who have an expertise in a particular area, and so I'm feeling a shift.
You're based in Alberta, in Edmonton, right?
Yeah.
At the University of Alberta. Alberta just lost its measles elimination. What do you call that?
Status, that's right.
Status.
Yeah.
I was looking for the word. And there are a lot of people that, especially since the pandemic, have really started to question even older vaccines that we've had for decades since we were kids, and had accepted they were safe. But the flip side of that is that people felt shamed during the pandemic, that they felt that there was perhaps a conversation between elites and other people about the science, about health. How do policymakers deal with that? So on one hand, you need to convince people that this is good science, but they might be reticent, and where does the work happen, I guess?
So there definitely has been a spillover effect from the pandemic, right? Where the conspiracies and the rage and the misinformation from the pandemic has spilled over to other health domains, and really to every corner of our lives. And I think this is really important to emphasize. Research tells us that misinformation, that distrust, that idea that they've been shamed, and I want to be really careful here because I want to empathize with them, the people that feel that way, and we want to listen to them, what brought them to that place. But research tells us it's been largely manufactured by those spreading misinformation. And we know this because it's almost entirely partisan. It's almost entirely partisan. Let's use the United States, and by the way, these numbers map on, especially to Alberta, but map onto Canada more broadly. In the United States, the decrease in trust in science and the increase in vaccination hesitancy has happened almost entirely on one side of the political spectrum. Almost entirely. Now, I'm not being partisan about this because historically it's shifted back and forth. And for most of my career, I got the hate mail from the left, right? I think that's really important to emphasize, right? So I don't want to, I had to, there's different ways of knowing, you're being closed-minded, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's almost entirely on the right. And that tells us that that distrust has to do with community, it has to do with political positioning, it has to do with the weaponization of these concerns, and it has to do with the creation of grievance, right? And by the way, this happens to all of us. We all do this. And one of my favorite examples of it is, do you remember the weekend that Trump died? Right? It was like in September. And, all of my friends, something's up, something's happening. How come we haven't heard from him?
Disappeared.
He disappeared. It was just, we
There's
hadn't heard from him for 6
pictures of
hours.
him and
Yeah.
his legs and all that. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And my entire family was caught up in this, right? That's a very good example of how this happens to all of us. Like, so I want to be careful. I'm not trying to be partisan here and point fingers, but we need to recognize that. Why is that important? Because the fact that this is so political and so much about political identity is going to make it more challenging to counter it, because and maybe even some of your listeners are immediately saying, well, he's picking on me or he's blaming me. I don't mean that at all. I mean that this has become a challenge, and we have to figure out how we can still deal with misinformation, even though it has become so much about political identity.
So is it what you're saying that people didn't, they might have had an allegiance to one political movement or another, but they didn't start off necessarily everyone questioning vaccines, for example, but they were pushed into that mode of view by different political actors?
Well, it becomes part of your community's belief, right? And there's been a lot of, again, not just speculating on this, there's a lot of evidence from around the world on this, like a fairly large body of evidence on this. In fact, we've just finished a review paper where we're exploring all the evidence on this exact phenomenon, right? But people perhaps come because they're curious, they're concerned, and they find themselves in a community where this is the ideological flag. One of my favorite examples of this.
And they put the jacket on.
They put the jacket on. Now it's part of my,
Okay.
and again, I said it probably the fourth time I've said this, but we all do this, right? One of my favorite examples is ivermectin. So this is an anti-parasitic that has become a cult, right? You could go on the streets of Ottawa right now and ask 1,000 people, do you think ivermectin works for cancer, autism, or COVID as a cure? Look, ivermectin is an antiparasitic, extremely effective in that context. How an individual answers that question, does ivermectin work for cancer, autism, COVID? How they answer that question, I can tell them who they voted for, their views on climate change, on trans rights, probably a list of 20 other things, right? And that really highlights the degree to which these health beliefs are as much about community and political identity as they are the actual science.
So just to wrap up, if we wanted to have a Canada that was better protected, especially against health misinformation, which is your main area of focus, what would be a couple of things that you think that we should do from a policy standpoint?
So absolutely teach critical thinking skills. I think that, and it sounds like a pat response, obviously we should do this, but I think that we need to take this very, very seriously. And in countries that do it, like Finland, hard to study this well, a lot of variables. The body of evidence says this does work, right? That we can make communities resilient by teaching critical thinking skills. And I wrote a piece a while back where I argued we should start in kindergarten and should be taught in every grade. And look, I'm not talking, hopefully this is more politically palatable, because we're not telling people what to believe. We're giving people the tools to decide for themselves, right? And so I think that should be, media literacy, all those things, and those tools should be available for every Canadian. There have been studies that show that even teaching people very basic things, they've done these studies around the world, can make a difference. And we need to do that. We need to support and resource pre-bunking and debunking. And again, this is not telling people what to believe, but talking about what the scientific consensus is
Pre-bunking.
on a topic. So pre-bunking is, look, this new product's going to be coming out, or this new approach, policies that people are going to use anecdotes, or testimonials, or scary stories. Anecdote and testimonials can be interesting, but they're not a body of evidence, right? You do that kind of thing, it really does prepare people, right? They've done it with respect to electoral skepticism, like you can't trust, you shouldn't vote, right? And studies have shown that pre-bunking can make people feel more confident in voting and encourage participation in the democratic process. So those things really work. We do want to debunk, so we want to correct the information. And we want to invite people to use nudges. Now that sounds kind of scary, nudge, that sounds like you're trying to fool me. Not at all. It's just inviting people to pause even for a moment before they engage with content. So they're, disconnecting from that emotional response and inviting sort of more critical thinking. Just that little thing can make a difference. And by the way, all of those things are policy decisions because we have to create resources to allow all those things to happen in a robust manner. And yes, sometimes there's going to be policy that needs, regulatory policy that needs to happen. And believe it or not, I think that should be an instrument of last resort because I am a big believer in freedom of expression and open discourse. And by the way, all the tools I just talked about, those are things that happen in the marketplace of ideas, right? But regulation may be necessary. That's more challenging, I think. But even things like, more transparency for the algorithms, for example, that are used to create our information environment. Who could be against transparency? So I think we should also think about those kinds of responses too.
Timothy Caulfield, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to Futureproofing Canada. I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, BMO Financial Group, for its generous support of this podcast. Our executive producer is Ricardo Montrose. Our production assistants are Elissa Khoury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and edited by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you liked what you heard and you want to find out more about the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org, and you can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Futureproofing Canada.